I never thought I'd be the guy standing in front of a mirror, questioning everything I knew about my life. That's the funny thing about betrayal. It doesn't just rip apart your trust in someone else. It makes you doubt yourself, your choices, and even your ability to tell what's real and what's not. Madison and I had been married for 5 years, together for 7, and I thought we were solid. We weren't perfect, sure, but we had a life together. A home in Raleigh, North Carolina, a dog named Bentley, and plans for the future. Or at least I thought we did. The first sign was small, something you'd shrug off if you weren't paying attention. Madison had started staying late at work more often, something about new deadlines at the marketing firm where she worked. She came home tired, distracted, but I didn't think much of it. Work gets stressful, but then there were the changes in her phone habits. She'd always been casual about leaving her phone lying around, but now it was glued to her hand. Notifications turned off. A quiet tension followed her into every room. I ignored it for a while. I told myself I was being paranoid, that she was just stressed, but the doubts crept in anyway. It wasn't until one Sunday afternoon, when she said she was going to brunch with a friend, that I decided to check her location. It was something we'd set up years ago, more for safety than anything else. She wasn't at the brunch spot she'd mentioned. She was downtown, in a part of the city we never went to. The pit in my stomach told me I already knew the answer, but I couldn't admit it to myself. Not yet. I waited for her to come home, my mind racing. When she walked through the door, she had a smile on her face, the kind that used to make my day. But now it felt hollow. I asked her about the brunch, about her friend, and she answered easily, smoothly, without hesitation. She was good at this, too good. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of suspicion pressing down on my chest. I knew I had to find out the truth. The next morning, I installed tracking software on her phone. It felt wrong, invasive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind my back. The guilt ate at me as I set it up, but the fear of being lied to was worse. Within a few days, the messages started coming in. A name I didn't recognize, Kyle. The texts were casual at first, then flirtatious, and then explicit. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. She wasn't just cheating, she was flaunting it in a way she thought I'd never see. I didn't confront her right away. I needed more than texts. I needed proof that couldn't be denied. I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I'd do in a million years. The idea of a stranger following my wife around felt surreal, but I had to know. Over the next few weeks, the evidence piled up. Photos of Madison and Kyle at a hotel, walking hand in hand through the park, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Each image was a knife to the heart, cutting deeper than the last. When I finally confronted her, she didn't deny it. She looked at me, her eyes wide and brimming with tears, and said she was sorry. That it had been a mistake, a moment of weakness. She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel the way I was feeling. But instead, I just stood there numb. "We can fix this," she said. "We can go to counseling. I'll do anything." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I wasn't ready to throw away 7 years of my life, even if she had. Counseling started off rocky. Madison said all the right things, how she regretted what she'd done, how she was committed to rebuilding my trust. Our therapist encouraged me to express my anger, my pain, and I did. But something about Madison's apologies felt rehearsed, like she was checking boxes on a to-do list. Still, I stayed. I told myself it was for us, for the life we'd built together. But deep down, I think I stayed because I wasn't ready to face the truth, that the woman I loved wasn't who I thought she was. For a while, things seemed to improve. Madison blocked Kyle, changed her routines, and tried to be more present. I started to believe we could get through this. But then the cracks began to show again. Late nights at work, a sudden need for privacy. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the nagging doubts came creeping back. It wasn't until I overheard a hush phone call late one night that I realized my instincts were right. She was in the kitchen, whispering into her phone, her back to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, soft, intimate. I felt a wave of rage and despair, but I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I waited until she went to bed and checked her phone. There were no messages, no calls logged, nothing to suggest she'd spoken to anyone. She'd learned to cover her tracks. But this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I started watching her more closely, tracking her movements, her habits. It didn't take long to confirm my suspicions. She'd been careful, but not careful enough. There were moments when her mask slipped, an overly casual explanation for where she'd been, a flash of guilt in her eyes when I asked an innocent question. I knew she was seeing Kyle again, and this time, I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of it. I confronted her a second time, armed with the evidence I'd gathered. She didn't cry this time. She didn't beg. She just looked at me, her expression a mixture of anger and resignation. "You don't understand," she said. "It's not about you." Her words stung more than any lie she'd told. It wasn't about me? How could it not be? I told her to leave, to pack her things and get out of the house. She didn't argue. She just nodded and started gathering her things. The house felt eerily quiet after Madison left. I spent the first few nights drinking too much, trying to drown out the thoughts of her and Kyle. The memories of our time together, vacations, holidays, lazy Sundays on the couch, felt like they belonged to someone else. I kept looking around the house, noticing little traces of her that she hadn't taken. A scarf draped over the chair, a half-used bottle of perfume on the dresser. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, not yet. I filed for divorce a week later. The process was brutal, not because Madison fought it, but because every signature, every piece of paperwork felt like admitting failure. She didn't contest anything. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it left me with more questions than answers. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't even recognize. I started seeing a therapist, not because I wanted to, but because my brother insisted. He said I needed to talk to someone to unpack what I was feeling before it consumed me. At first, I hated it. Sitting in a small room, spilling my guts to a stranger, felt pointless. But over time, it helped. I started to see patterns, to understand how much of myself I'd lost trying to hold on to Madison. The turning point came when I found an old journal Madison had left behind. It wasn't full of love letters or confessions. It was a work journal, filled with notes from meetings and project deadlines. But tucked between the pages was a photo of us from our first anniversary. We were sitting by the lake, her head on my shoulder, both of us smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. Seeing that photo broke something inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the relationship, but for the future we'd never have. I threw myself into work after that, taking on extra projects and staying late at the office. It wasn't healthy, but it was a distraction. My coworkers noticed the change in me, offering sympathetic looks and the occasional, "You okay?" I lied every time. "Yeah, just busy," I'd say, forcing a smile. The truth was I wasn't okay. I was running from the silence that waited for me at home. One evening, as I scrolled mindlessly through social media, I saw a photo that made my stomach drop. Madison and Kyle, sitting at a bar, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. It wasn't jealousy I felt, it was rage. She had moved on so easily, while I was left picking up the pieces of my life. I wanted to confront her, to scream at her, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused. Instead, I channeled that anger into something else, something calculated. I started digging into Kyle's life, piecing together who he was and what he valued. He worked in real estate, managing high-end properties downtown. He was married once, divorced, no kids. He had a sleek Instagram account full of expensive dinners and luxury vacations. It didn't take long to realize he was as shallow as they came. My first step was small, anonymous messages to his clients, suggesting they look deeper into his business practices. I didn't have proof of anything illegal, but I knew how to plant seeds of doubt. A few negative reviews online, a rumor about a pending lawsuit. It was enough to make him squirm, to make him start losing clients. Next, I turned my attention to Madison. She was still working at the same marketing firm, but I knew her reputation mattered to her. I sent an anonymous tip to her boss, claiming she'd been misusing company resources. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I knew she'd taken personal trips on company time. I had the photos to prove it. The fallout was slow but satisfying. Kyle's business began to crumble, his clients pulling out one by one. Madison's boss put her on probation, cutting her hours and her pay. They didn't know it was me, of course. I was careful, methodical, leaving no trace of my involvement. Watching their lives unravel was like a balm for my wounded pride. But revenge, I learned, doesn't heal you. It distracts you, gives you a sense of control, but it doesn't erase the pain. As satisfying as it was to see Kyle and Madison struggle, it didn't bring me peace. If anything, it left me feeling emptier. The truth was no amount of revenge could undo what they'd done. I decided to take a break from everything, work, the city, even therapy. I rented a cabin in the mountains, miles away from anyone who knew me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to just be. No plans, no distractions, just me and the quiet. It was harder than I expected. The silence forced me to confront things I'd been avoiding. My anger, my grief, my own role in the collapse of my marriage. During one of those quiet evenings, sitting by the fire, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I was holding on to Madison, not because I loved her, but because I hated the idea of starting over. I hated the thought of being alone, of rebuilding my life from scratch. But maybe being alone wasn't the worst thing. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. After returning from the cabin, I felt different, clearer, lighter in some ways, but also raw. I wasn't entirely healed, but I had started to let go of the need for revenge. It had been consuming me, turning me into someone I didn't want to be. Madison and Kyle no longer occupied my every waking thought. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I took up hiking again, a hobby I'd let fall by the wayside, and joined a local group that met every weekend. It wasn't about meeting people. It was about finding something that made me feel alive again. One Saturday morning, as I stood at the top of Pilot Mountain with the group, I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about Madison. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I let the wind whip through my hair, the crisp air filling my lungs, and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe life could still be good, even after everything. But healing isn't linear. A few weeks later, I ran into Madison at a coffee shop. She looked surprised to see me, but not uncomfortable. She even smiled, as if we were old friends catching up. It took everything in me to stay calm. She asked how I was, how work was going, if I'd been hiking much. Her casual tone infuriated me. Did she think we were fine now? That her betrayal was just water under the bridge? I kept my answers short and polite, excused myself, and walked out before I said something I'd regret. That encounter lingered in my mind for days. It wasn't her presence that bothered me. It was her ease. She acted like she hadn't destroyed me, like I wasn't still piecing myself together. I knew I couldn't control how she felt or how she acted, but it stung nonetheless. I talked about it with my therapist, who reminded me that closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you. It comes from within. I hated that answer, but I knew it was true. One evening, as I was walking Bentley through the park, a woman approached me. She looked vaguely familiar, and I realized it was one of Kyle's ex-clients. She recognized me from a social event I'd attended with Madison years ago. She mentioned that Kyle's business had gone under and casually asked if I knew anything about it. I shrugged, feigning ignorance, but inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. My actions had consequences, even if I wasn't proud of them. Around this time, I started dating again. It wasn't anything serious, just coffee dates and casual dinners with people I'd met through friends or apps. At first, it felt strange, like I was betraying some unspoken promise to myself. But as I got to know new people, I realized how much I'd missed genuine connection. These women didn't know my past, didn't see me as the man who'd been betrayed. They just saw me for who I was in that moment. It was liberating. One woman stood out, Claire. She was funny, kind, and unflinchingly honest. On our third date, I told her about Madison. I didn't go into the details, but I explained enough for her to understand why I was hesitant about relationships. Claire didn't judge me or offer empty reassurances. She simply said, "You're here now, and that's what matters." It was such a simple statement, but it hit me hard. Maybe she was right. Claire and I continued seeing each other, and over time, she became a steady presence in my life. She wasn't flashy or dramatic. She was real. She reminded me that love didn't have to be complicated or painful. It could be easy, supportive, and honest. With her, I felt like I was finally moving forward, leaving the shadows of Madison and Kyle behind me. But the past has a way of creeping back in. One day, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Kyle. He sounded frantic, desperate even. He said he knew I was the one who'd sabotaged his business and that he wanted to meet to clear the air. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to reopen that chapter of my life. But curiosity got the better of me. We met at a bar downtown, a neutral place where I knew I'd have the upper hand. Kyle looked rough. His once polished appearance was gone, replaced by unkempt hair and a worn expression. He started talking before I even sat down, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. I let him rant, sipping my drink silently, until he finally asked, "Why did you do it?" I looked him in the eye and said, "Because you took something from me, and I wanted you to feel what that was like." Kyle's expression shifted from anger to something like regret. He didn't apologize, men like him rarely do, but he seemed to understand, at least on some level, what I'd been through. He left shortly after, and I didn't feel satisfaction or closure. If anything, I felt empty. Revenge had been a distraction, but it hadn't healed me. That night, I deleted the last remaining pieces of evidence I had against him and Madison. It was time to let it all go. With Kyle and Madison firmly in the rearview mirror, I focused on my relationship with Claire. She brought out the best in me, encouraging me to pursue things I'd long abandoned: photography, cooking, even playing guitar again. For the first time in years, I felt like myself, not the broken man Madison had left behind. Claire didn't fix me. I'd done that work myself, but she reminded me of the kind of life I wanted to live. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Claire turned to me and said, "You're not the same person you were when we met." I asked her what she meant, and she smiled. "You seem lighter, freer, like you've stopped carrying the weight of the past." Her words stayed with me. Maybe I had let go, not all at once, but piece by piece. And in doing so, I'd made room for something better. Months later, I proposed to Claire during a quiet weekend getaway in Asheville. She said yes, her eyes shining with tears, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled me. I had built a life that was mine on my terms, and it was good. Looking back, I realized that Madison's betrayal was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another. It forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd ignored, to rebuild in ways I never thought possible. I don't think about her or Kyle anymore. They're just ghosts of a story I've moved past. My life with Claire is full of love, trust, and the kind of peace I didn't think I'd find again. And that's enough. Life with Claire wasn't perfect. No relationship is, but it was honest. We talked about everything, even the things that were hard to say. She knew about the scars I carried from Madison's betrayal, and she never dismissed them or tried to rush my healing. Instead, she reminded me, through her actions, what it meant to be with someone who truly cared. It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic promises. It was the little things. Making me coffee in the morning, laughing at my dumb jokes, holding my hand when I needed it most. There were times when memories of Madison crept in, uninvited. A song on the radio, a street we'd once walked together. They were faint echoes, not the gut-wrenching waves of pain they used to be, but they still lingered. I talked about them with Claire, and she listened without judgment. "It's okay to remember," she told me once. "It's part of what made you who you are." Her words helped me see the past not as something to erase, but as something to accept. It didn't define me, but it had shaped me. One evening, I received an email from Madison. It was brief, just a few sentences asking how I was and whether we could talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave her in the past where she belonged. But another part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Not for closure, I'd already found that, but out of curiosity. What could she possibly want from me now? I told Claire about the email, and she encouraged me to respond if I felt ready. "You don't owe her anything," she said. "But if it helps you in some way, I support it." I appreciated her understanding. And after some thought, I replied. I kept it short and neutral, agreeing to meet at a cafe downtown. I didn't expect much, but I wanted to put the lingering questions to rest once and for all. When I saw Madison at the cafe, she looked different. Her once perfectly styled hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She smiled faintly when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. She talked about how she'd been in therapy, how she'd been trying to make sense of her choices and the damage they'd caused. She apologized again, not just for the betrayal, but for how she'd handled everything afterward. Her apology felt genuine, but it didn't stir the emotions I thought it might. I wasn't angry anymore, nor did I feel pity for her. If anything, I felt a quiet sense of indifference. Her words didn't change anything. They didn't undo the past or rewrite the pain. But I appreciated her effort, her willingness to face me after all this time. "I hope you find peace," I told her before leaving. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was as close as I could get. Walking away from that cafe, I felt lighter. Madison's chapter in my life had truly closed, and I was okay with that. When I got home, I told Claire about the meeting. She listened quietly, her hand resting on mine. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Free," I said, and for the first time, I really meant it. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over me. They were just that, shadows fading into the distance. Claire and I continued building our life together. We adopted a second dog, a goofy Labrador named Daisy, who instantly bonded with Bentley. Our house became a place of warmth and laughter, filled with the kind of love I once thought I'd lost forever. Every day with Claire reminded me that happiness wasn't something you stumbled upon. It was something you built, brick by brick, with the right person by your side. A year after my meeting with Madison, I proposed to Claire during a quiet picnic by the lake. She said yes, her smile brighter than the sun, reflecting off the water. Our wedding was small, just family and close friends, but it was perfect. As we exchanged vows, I looked into her eyes and saw not just my present but my future. With Claire, I wasn't just surviving. I was living, and that made all the difference. On our honeymoon, as we walked along a beach at sunset, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it had all been part of the journey, a path I wouldn't wish on anyone but one I wouldn't change. Without it, I might never have found Claire. I might never have discovered the strength I didn't know I had. In the years that followed, life settled into a rhythm of contentment. Claire and I started a family, welcoming 2 beautiful kids into the world. Watching them grow, teaching them about love and resilience, became my greatest joy. The scars from my past remained, faint reminders of where I'd been, but they no longer hurt. They were just part of the story, a story that was still unfolding. Every now and then, I'd think about Madison, not in anger or sadness, but with a sense of acceptance. She was a lesson, a reminder of what I deserved and what I didn't. Wherever she was, I hoped she'd found her own version of peace. As for Kyle, I hadn't heard a word about him since that day in the bar. He was just another ghost of a life I'd left behind. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching my kids play with Bentley and Daisy, Claire came out with 2 glasses of wine. She handed me one and sat beside me, leaning her head on my shoulder. "You look happy," she said, her voice soft. I smiled, watching the scene before me. "I am," I said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I truly was. The lessons I'd learned from Madison's betrayal shaped me, but they didn't define me. They taught me the value of trust, the importance of self-worth, and the strength it takes to rebuild. With Claire, I found a love that wasn't perfect but was real. A love that didn't just heal me. It made me whole. And for that, I was grateful every single day. As the years went on, the clarity of what I'd endured sharpened. Madison's betrayal, though devastating at the time, felt like a distant storm I had weathered. There were still moments, rare as they were, when I'd catch myself wondering what might have been if things had gone differently. Would I still have found Claire? Would I have become the man I was now? Those thoughts didn't come with bitterness anymore, just quiet reflection. Life doesn't hand you answers. It gives you choices. and I had made mine. Claire and I spent our 10th anniversary at the same lake where I had proposed to her. The kids stayed with my brother for the weekend, giving us uninterrupted time to reconnect. As we sat on the dock, the water reflecting the stars, Claire leaned her head against my shoulder. "I love our life," she said, her voice soft and steady. I smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Me too." It was simple, but it was true. The life we built together was everything I never knew I needed. One day, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were remnants of my life with Madison. Old photos, anniversary cards, little mementos I hadn't had the heart to throw away. I stared at the box for a long time, debating what to do with it. Eventually, I carried it downstairs and placed it in the trash. I didn't need those pieces of my past anymore. The memories that mattered were already with me, and the rest belonged to a chapter one had closed. Shortly after that, I received an unexpected call from an old mutual friend of Madison's and mine. She mentioned that Madison had moved to another state and was now remarried. She sounded happy, content. I thanked the friend for letting me know, but the news didn't stir much in me. Madison's life was hers to live, just as mine was mine. There was no malice, no lingering resentment, only a quiet acknowledgement that we had both moved on in our own ways. As my children grew, I saw in them the resilience I'd fought so hard to find in myself. They were kind, curious, and unafraid to ask questions about the world. I wanted to be the kind of father who could teach them the importance of trust, honesty, and love, not just through words but through actions. Watching them, I realized that the legacy I was leaving wasn't defined by the pain I'd endured, but by the strength I'd built in its aftermath. One summer evening, as Claire and I sat on the porch watching the fireflies, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever regret anything?" I thought about her question, about the years of heartbreak, anger, and rebuilding. "I regret that it happened," I said after a moment. "But I don't regret where it brought me. Without that pain, I might never have found you. I might never have built this life." She smiled, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "Me too," she said. "Every choice led us here." In the quiet moments of my life, I often found myself marveling at how far I'd come. The road hadn't been easy, and there were times I wasn't sure I'd make it. But standing on the other side of it all, I realized that the scars left by Madison's betrayal weren't marks of failure. They were proof of survival. They were reminders of the battles I'd fought and won, the lessons I'd learned, and the man I'd become. Years later, as I watched my daughter walk across the stage at her high school graduation, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Claire sat beside me, squeezing my hand, her eyes brimming with tears. Our son, now in middle school, cheered loudly from his seat. This was the life I'd built, the life I'd fought for. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the pain, and for the love that had carried me through it all. One rainy afternoon, while organizing old files on my computer, I came across a folder labeled Madison. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I'd find. Inside were the last remnants of my investigation. Photos, texts, and emails I'd gathered during the darkest time of my life. I stared at them for a long moment before deleting the folder. It was a final act of letting go, a quiet but significant step toward closing that chapter for good. Claire noticed the change in me immediately. "You seem lighter," she said one evening as we cooked dinner together. I nodded, realizing she was right. "I think I finally let go of the last piece," I told her. She smiled, her hand brushing against mine as we stood by the stove. "I'm proud of you," she said. Her words, simple as they were, filled me with a warmth I hadn't known was missing. As I approached my 50th birthday, I began reflecting on the life I'd built. It wasn't the life I'd imagined when I was younger. It was better. The love I shared with Claire, the joy of watching our children grow, the peace of knowing I'd overcome so much, it all felt like a gift. The past was still there, but it no longer held power over me. I had turned the pain into something beautiful, something lasting. One day, while walking along the beach during a family vacation, my son asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Dad, do you ever get scared of making mistakes?" I thought about his question, about all the missteps and wrong turns that had brought me to this moment. All the time, I told him, but mistakes aren't the end of the story. They're just part of it. And sometimes, they lead you to something better. He nodded, seeming to understand in a way that only a child could. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat with Claire on the balcony of our beach rental, watching the waves crash against the shore. "We've had a good life," I said, my voice quiet but firm. She turned to me, her eyes shining in the fading light. "We've had a beautiful life," she corrected. And she was right. Despite everything, it had been beautiful, because we made it that way. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss interesting life stories, and write a comment if you like the story. See you.